Hello, hello. I am back. You are back. We are back. Isn't that nice? Isn't that nice? All right. So we're here for the High Middle Ages, video one, and we're going to talk about some of the aspects of the High Middle Ages. The characteristic, well, a few of the characteristic aspects, and then we're also going to talk about sort of some high points. I'm gonna hit some highlights, and I'm gonna hit them pretty fast. I'm not gonna dwell on them a lot. So, you know, I don't want I don't want you to think that we're gonna just do one or two things. We won't necessarily get into a ton of detail. Is sort of what I'm saying. With all this stuff. But I want to at least mention it to you so that you get at least the significance of why this was a particular feature of the High Middle Ages. And sorry, I only have so much time, but I can give you at least a little bit of the flavor of the High Middle Ages. And then next time we've got some of the stuff that's going to come along and sort of undo a lot of the things happening in the High Middle Ages. Well, not undo them, but it's going to be bad things, warfare, plague, bad things, and then we have the transition to the Renaissance, and it's a criminally short amount of time to spend on the Middle Ages. It is, but it's what we got. And I hate doing it that way, but anyway. Um okay, so let's just dig in. Last time I talked about the transition to the High Middle Ages. And the main thing I talked about in it was the unification of the church, which was sort of one of the signal accomplishments or signal achievements in medieval Europe that indicated that the Dark Ages, you couldn't really call it the Dark Ages anymore. Now, like I said, a lot of historians of this period get really shirty about the use of the phrase the Dark Ages to describe the early Middle Ages between the end of the Roman Empire and about the year 1000, roughly, like 1050. Um, but I think it's not a completely unfair description, even if the description has been misapplied to the entire Middle Ages sometimes, but you don't want to do that. And even if there was artistic innovation and cultural innovation going on during what we would call the Dark Ages, attempts to rebuild society, like with the Merovingian kingdom and the Carolingian Renaissance that I talked about. Um, Even though there were attempts to put the broken society of medieval Europe back together again, I think it's fair to call that early period, roughly 500 to roughly 1000, the Dark Ages. But the unification of the church in Europe is definitely a sign that you can't think of this as a Dark Age anymore. I'm not going to rehash all the details because that was the last video. But the quickie version of it is that uh, the church managed to, the popes in Rome, the reformer popes, managed to put together a kind of unified sense of identity for all Christians in Europe, stretching from Ireland all the way to Italy and over towards Eastern Europe. Um, they managed to create Christendom, the domain of all Christians. Um, and Christendom was bigger than any kingdom or dukedom or county or fief of any kind. Christendom transcended these cultural and proto-national boundaries and gave a sense of unity to medieval Europe. No longer did you have a bunch of individual churches controlled by, the local scabby guy who would appoint, one of his relatives to run the church in that area. You had a unified organization, a unified establishment of faith that that was networked all across Europe and created the closest thing available to a public institution in this period. Um, it was even headquartered out of Rome. So, in a lot of ways, it really feels like a new Roman Empire. More so than the Merovingians, much more so than the Merovingians, more so than the Holy Roman Empire. Um, the church claimed spiritual authority over every lord in Europe, including the kings and the emperors. Um, it claimed this right. It claimed to be the only church uh, when it dismissed the Eastern Church by excommunicating the patriarch in Constantinople. It exercised its temporal political influence by calling crusade in 1096 and sending tens of thousands of European knights to the Holy Land to fight in the name of God, just because the Pope said so. The Pope said so, and kings and dukes and counts all over the place jumped. They took their knights and they rode east on a multi-year military effort that would cost a lot of them everything. And they did it because the Pope told them to. And that's power. That's not just spiritual power, that's temporal power. So the unification of the church was a sign that the Dark Age in Europe had come to an end. Not that the medieval period was over, but that the Dark Age had come to an end. Because you had something that transcended the limitations of what a Dark Age society can do. A society that is genuinely in a Dark Age is not going to have a powerful, centralized organization like that that spans the entirety of Europe. It has that kind of authority and power. That's just not, like, definitionally not something that happens. So much in the same way that, much in the same way that the Iliad is a sign of the end of the Dark Age, the unification of the church in medieval Europe in the period of about I want to say mostly in the 10th and 11th century. The period or the unification of the church in medieval Europe is definitely a sign that the Dark Age in Europe had come to an end. Okay. So that's just sort of a little bit of a recap on what we did last time. It wasn't the only thing. The 11th century, which is, say, the 1000s, saw some astonishing achievements that would lay the groundwork, or the pattern, if you will, for what was going to happen next for the High Middle Ages, and the things that would characterize the High Middle Ages rather than the Dark Ages. The short version is that the High Middle Ages, while they are part of the medieval period, they are the least medieval part of the medieval period, if you will. And it makes sense if you think about it. We mark the medieval period primarily by the rise of feudalism in the wake of the collapse of Roman authority throughout Europe. Roman society provided public institutions, it provided the rule of law, even if it was governed by an autocrat. It provided at least the semblance of the rule of law. It provided a shape and a structure to life in Europe. It was run by civilians, not by people who fought. I mean, that became less true in the latter years of the Roman Empire, as you get the military installing a whole lot of emperors. But yeah, generally speaking, as far as the bureaucratic functions and the day-to-day administration of the different aspects of the Roman Empire, it was run by civilians. But with the collapse of Roman government and Roman authority in Europe, a new society, a feudal society, based entirely on fighting, run by people whose entire way of life was built around warfare, arose. And as I said before, the characteristics of this of feudal society, the characteristics of it are private relationships rather than public spaces, rather than public institutions. So we have the homage, the exchange of vows between vassal and lord, rather than simply citizenship in a public polity, and the ability to avail yourself of public institutions. You have to avail yourself to the terms of private promises, of oaths that you have sworn to people above you, and oaths that they have made reciprocally to you. So if you want justice, you don't go to the courthouse and file a lawsuit. You go to the local lord, Mr. Scabby Guy, and his Scabby Guy friends. You go to them when the local lord is holding court, and you ask for justice from a person, not an institution. So the private relationships over institutions, localism, which again is due to the fact that it's all based on private relationships, and lack of trade, meaningful trade because of the localism, lack of urbanism because of the lack of meaningful trade, and a culture based entirely on violence. Those are the signal characteristics of feudal society, and those are the main characteristics that we see of the society that we find in the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire in Dark Ages Europe. So with everything changing, though, in the 11th century, 11th and 12th century especially, with everything changing in that sort of central period in the medieval era, coming into the High Middle Ages, we're going to see a greater trend towards centralized governments, the development of complex feudalism to the point where there is kind of a working bureaucracy, and thus something resembling public institutions. We're going to see a lessening, not vanishing, but a lessening of the intense violence of the Dark Ages period in Europe. There will be more cases where medieval lords and disputes with other lords will appeal to the judgment of a mutual lord over both of them. Um, and uh, something like the judgments of the rule of law. Not precisely, but getting there. Um, we will start to see the development of trade, more significant trade and diplomatic relationships, which is related to the fact that there's less violence, so you can have more trade, because you can actually go from one place to another without getting killed. Um, and we'll see more urban development because of more trade, and less localism because of more trade and mobility. And also because of the more centralized governments with a complex feudalism that kind of takes the place of a bureaucracy, a proper bureaucracy. So, um, so basically, what we're going to be seeing in the High Middle Ages is the development of a bunch of features that are not as medieval as before. If I told you that the characteristic features of medieval society were violence, localism, lack of urbanization, lack of trade, and lack of public institutions, then all of those things will be less true in the High Middle Ages. So why are the High Middle Ages still a part of the medieval period if they are lacking the characteristics that I said were medieval? Well, two reasons. First of all, because I said less, not untrue. I said it was less true. It wasn't untrue. Um, while society is developing something like the rule of law again, while society is developing something like public institutions, while it is developing something like a functioning bureaucracy, as trade is recovering, as urbanism is recovering, the earlier characteristics of society are still very much present. They are those characteristics that define what we would call a dark age, the dark ages. They're still there. They're just slacking off a bit. So we can think of the High Middle Ages as a period, like a cooling off period, where these aspects that I mentioned earlier, especially the endemic violence, um, are dropping. These are slowly going away, um, and it's not an immediate process. So this doesn't all go away during the 11th, 12th centuries, and the High Middle Ages are a period of, you know, 300-400 years where society is transforming itself into something less thoroughly medieval than what had gone before, if we're defining medieval as being more feudal. It's transforming itself into something less thoroughly medieval, but it's not an instant process. So we still call the High Middle Ages part of the Middle Ages, because there is still this dominance. And particularly, two things stand out as kind of markers. We the dominance of the military class in running everything in Europe was certainly, like I said, in the early medieval period, in the Dark Ages, quote unquote Dark Ages, so called. In the Dark Ages, we see this feudal society, this society based entirely on violence, spring up in the wake of the collapse of Rome, And so the people who do the violence, the professional violence doers, the fighters, the scabby people, are the ones who run that society, quite reasonably. If your society is based entirely on violence, the violent people are running it. So, um, lost my train of thought. Oh, right. So a good way to measure, uh, whether you're still in the medieval period is, are the are the people who are in charge still the professional violence doers? Are they the ones that are still, still running everything? And I think that becomes less and less true gradually over the course of the Middle Ages. Not untrue, again, not untrue. Um, but you see more and more over the course of the High Middle Ages that the very tippy top noble types are doing less and less of the fighting for themselves, um, and relying more and more on the lesser nobles and paid mercenaries. I'll get to that in a moment. To do fighting for them. Um, until you can have people who are very successful. You can have a very successful king who isn't much of a fighter at all. You can have a very successful leader who is not really much for warfare, period. And that is that should have been impossible or next to impossible in the early Middle Ages, in the so-called Dark Ages. And the fact that it's not as much in the High Middle Ages shows that things are changing. And so we can kind of mark the end of the Middle Ages in a couple of ways. There's all kinds of things that you can cite for it. One thing that you can cite for it is when the burden of fighting battles, when the burden of warfare had shifted primarily away from the people who were running the society, the nobility, and on to professional soldiers who were not nobility. When it became the fact that wars were primarily being fought by professional soldiers from the commoner class rather than by the nobles, that's a that's a big change. That's a sign that whatever defined the medieval era isn't happening anymore. You could pick out as the end of the medieval era when there was a substantial enough middle class of non-noble merchants and artisans and other such people and professionals who had enough money that they were exerting significant control over and political influence on society. So that even though the nobles ruled in name, that this vigorous, wealthy middle class had massive amounts of social power. And when you reach that point, then another thing that was considered definitional of the Middle Ages, which is that the nobles, the fighting class, was in charge, that is also not true anymore. So you can see that there's like a two-pronged thing there, that you start off with the people in charge, or the noble class, and what they do is they fight. And then over the course of the High Middle Ages, they start to fight less and less. And they're also less and less in charge in a de facto sense. So that by the end of the High Middle Ages, you have a noble class that is nominally in charge, but now significantly beholden to a non-noble class of very wealthy people, and they're not even doing the fighting anymore. So why the hell do we keep them around? I don't know. Ask the English. They're still keeping their nobles around, and they definitely don't do anything useful. That's actually a huge debate over there. Anyway. But yeah, so there's other things you can pick out. There's the beginnings of the Italian Renaissance, which a lot of people tie to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Um, the changeover to non nobles doing the fighting primarily is usually tied to sort of the back half of the Hundred Years' War, which takes us into the 1400s, into the 1400 1450 range. It's tied to economic changes in society after the Black Death, which takes us into the late 1300s, early 1400s. You could tie it to the development of the printing press in 1455, or even, if you want to put it at the latest possible date, the opening of the Western Hemisphere for colonization by Europe with the voyages of Columbus in 1492. Um, pushing real close to that 1500 date I've given. It's not important to have a precise date. It's important to understand that what happens is Rome falls, a new kind of society emerges that is a feudal society. Um, the exchange of personal oaths rather than public institutions, localism, lack of urbanism, lack of trade, uh, endemic violence because it is a society based on violence run by people who do violence professionally. That's sort of definitional of the medieval period. This feudalism is definitional of it, and it is the rule of how European society is operating between roughly 500, fall of Rome, and roughly 1,000-ish, 1,050. And then some stuff happens. You got the unification of the church, which creates the closest thing to a public institution and a functioning bureaucracy, and it is non-local. Um, so that's very much against the graying of those definitional features. You got the Crusades, which just demonstrates the power of the church. You're going to have some stuff I'm going to talk about here with vernacular literature, with founding universities, the Norman invasion of England, things like that, that are going to sort of that are going to change the landscape, so that over the course of the High Middle Ages, those definitional features that I talk about are dropping away or becoming less and less central. More trade, less localism, less endemic violence, therefore more trade and less localism, more urbanism, um, spaces that are or are close to public spaces and public institutions. Something like a functioning bureaucracy is emerging. The non-noble classes are gaining prominence on the battlefield and in politics and commerce. Um, the noble class is doing less fighting and thus has to find some other way of justifying its existence and deeming itself to be unique and special. Um, so yeah, basically what you need to understand is that the first part of the Middle Ages is hardcore feudalism. There's a transitional period around the 11th century and into the 12th with the 12th century Renaissance. And then, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and then over the course of from about 1100, from about 1200 to 1500, those definitional features, those features that make it medieval rather than something else, are dropping away, and then we stop calling it the Middle Ages, we stop calling it the medieval period when we reach one of those decisive points that I talked about, or at least somewhere in that vicinity. And you can pretty much put most of that between 1450 and 1500. So maybe the Middle Ages in Europe didn't end at a precise time on a precise day, but it definitely ended. It was, the ending was in that 50-year period. I think we can be pretty comfortable saying between 1450 and 1500. Okay. Now, a lot of this stuff I'm going to talk about: the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, fall of Constantinople, things like that. Well, fall of Constantinople, I'll kick ahead to the next one. So some of this stuff I'm going to talk about in the next video. I may talk about like the rise of chivalry and romanticism in the next video too, because this one's already a half an hour. But I'm gonna talk about some of these. I'm gonna go in and dig in a little bit on some of these things. Some of the ways that you can see how to put this, the realization of some of this stuff. Hold on a second. Let me pause this for just a moment. Okay. Anyway, so what was I going to say? Alright, so yeah, I'm going to dig into some of those examples and flesh them out a little more. So let's roll back to the 11th century. I told you one of the big examples of how things were changing was the First Crusade. Well, was the Great Schism, was a sign of things to come in 1054, and then the First Crusade in 1096. And I posted those videos, links to those videos, anyway, for you to watch. The First Crusade in 1096 was an example. The church had been becoming unified for a while, and the Pope had been asserting his authority over Christendom for a while, or building it. But the First Crusade was a good example of it. It was like, oh, this guy really does have authority over Christendom. Now, this would not be an undisputed authority. Various nobles, once they realized what was happening, they're like, oh God, the Pope says jump and we all jump. I don't want that. I'm a king. There will be a lot of back and forth for a while now. But the fact that the Pope's even in the mix, considering that he does not have an army of his own and he is not a feudal lord, is a sign that things are different. That the guys with swords are not running everything now. So the First Crusade in 1096 is an example of how things are changing. But so is, to roll it back 30 years, so is the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Now, coincidentally, 1066 is also considered kind of the end of the Viking era. And I talked about that, or if I didn't talk about it, I should have. And maybe I will re-record that video so that I can talk about it in the future. But 1066 is considered the end of the Viking era, when Harold Godwinson defeats Harold Haraldsson. And I realize there's a lot of Harold. Harold Godwinson was the Anglo-Saxon king of England, and Harold Haraldsson was sort of a Viking invader trying to conquer England. And by the 11th century, the cultural impetus behind the whole Viking thing had kind of petered out. The Viking expeditions that had started as raiding, that had started as pure raiding, had kind of given way to colonization and building of permanent settlements, even to the point where in Norman France, those Vikings were given territory by the King of France on the condition that they helped protect France from other Vikings. And they became the Norman French, assimilating into French life. They're going to come up here again here in a second. But the cultural impetus of the Viking Age had played itself out, and sort of the last gasp of Viking expansionism, of Scandinavian expansionism in the Viking era was the attempt to conquer England. Harold Godwinson defeats Harold Haraldsson in 1066, and that puts that to an end pretty much. But also in 1066, and so close together, so close upon that battle, that Harold Godwinson, after finishing that battle, had to haul ass south to meet a new threat, was the invasion of England by the Norman French. A guy named, we call him William in English, his name would have been Guillaume in French, and he was a bastard son of an important noble in Normandy. He had ambition, but because he was not a legitimate child, there was only so far up he could go. There was only so much he could claim in terms of inheritance or power from his father. And he saw an opportunity, whereas the Vikings had been unable to conquer England. Guillaume thought he could do it. So Guillaume the Bastard gets up an army in Norman France, which is right in the northern part of France. Right in the northern part of France. And he crosses the English Channel, and he invades England. Like I said, Harold Godwinson raced south to meet him. And it was not, it didn't work out. Maybe it was because Godwinson was just not ready. Maybe it was because he was just not ready for this kind of enemy, because the Normans were excellent warriors, and they sort of set the standard for warfare in this period. So maybe it's just that they weren't ready for the Normans, or maybe it's because they were worn out from so long of repelling the Vikings. Maybe that's, it's hard to say which is genuinely the case. But in any case, they met at Hastings in southern England. Hastings used to be a multimedia store also, like books and movies and music and stuff like that. So whenever I say, when I'm teaching this, whenever I say that Harold Godwinson and William or Guillaume the Bastard met at Hastings, I imagine them like walking into the store, like one of them's chilling out, and the other one walks into the store and goes, "Hey, I told you I'd meet you here." And the other one's like, "Yeah, okay, cool. Meet me by the movies." It didn't happen that way. For one thing, they did not have DVD players then. They were still using VHS. Anyway. Morgan's taking a nap, so I'm not getting the laughter I like again. Anyway. But no, they met at a place called Hastings, and they fought. Harold Godwinson lost pretty badly. And it's weird to think that the conquest of England was mostly effected by one battle, but again, Harold Godwinson had been trying to repel Vikings for a long time. Successfully, mind you, but still. And with his army destroyed, there just wasn't a lot of resistance. So William was able to set himself up as King of England. He's considered the first King of England, even though there were definitely kings in England before that. William is considered the first King of England, rather than just like of a part of it, like Wessex or Sussex or something like that. William is the first King of England. And again, you notice the change there. No longer Guillaume the Bastard. Instead, he is William the Conqueror. Because, there you go. Anyway. William the Conqueror, first King of England. And that's fine. We've seen people conquer other folks before in the Dark Ages, so that wouldn't be special, except the way William went about setting up his kingdom. There were plenty of kings in early medieval Europe. Plenty of them. These kings were dealing with... I can't get into all that. That's cute. Suffice to say, the short version is the kings in Europe had vassals underneath them that had traditional rights that stretched all the way back to the Roman Empire sometimes. And they were dealing with a patchwork of sort of legal ideas and limitations on the nature of the promises that could be made and the obligations under oaths and things like that. It was messy. It was super, super messy. And centralized power was hard to come by. Like I said, the Merovingians had a kingdom that stretched over pretty much all of France. But the Merovingian kings in themselves did not wield a lot of centralized power the way that, say, a Roman consul would have wielded power in the Republican era. Because there's only so much you can do to enforce your will on people when you have a bunch of nobles under you who are almost as powerful as you are, or as powerful as you are, or more powerful than you are. And even when these nobles are recognizing the king as their sovereign, they're like, oh no, you're the king, we'll listen to you. The fact of the matter was that in a lot of cases, if they decided to stop listening, there was not a lot the king could really do. The machinery was not in place. In Republican Rome, and even in Imperial Rome, until everything started to go to crap, in Republican Rome, the bureaucratic institutions that were layered almost in an almost federal-like structure, the bureaucratic institutions enabled the central authorities in Rome to exert power even over areas far distant from Rome. The fact that, like for instance, the fact that Julius Caesar, in the last days of the Republic, as governor of Gaul, the fact that he was able to get away with kind of doing whatever he wanted and ignoring Rome was a sign that the institutions were failing, that things were not going great. And we shouldn't be surprised that the kings in early medieval and so-called Dark Ages Europe were not able to exert effective authority over huge areas of land without the cooperation of the subordinate, the lords under, the vassal lords. We shouldn't be too surprised because, again, remember, localism is a signal characteristic of the Dark Ages, of the feudal era. Anyway, what's different about William is that when William sets himself up as king, William does not acknowledge that anyone else owns any land, which was different. There were kings in Europe, but the vassals under the kings had their own land that, in theory, the king couldn't take away from them because they weren't lands belonging to the king. William immediately asserted that all land in England belonged to the king, period, and every land, every bit of land that any other noble held was held only because the king said that they could hold it. He set up a much more complex and robust system of feudal relations of vassal lord relationships underneath the throne. A genuinely complex a complex aristocracy. So that rather than just having a layer of nobles that are more or less equal in rank, if not wealth and power, and then a king that rules above them, in other words, just a slight advance on simple kingship, rather than having that, and we had seen some differentiation, like some new ranks start to emerge in early medieval Europe. But what we saw under William the Conqueror was we saw a much more sort of nuanced and complicated feudalism arise with multiple layers of ranks of nobility, um, barons, earls, counts, dukes, all the way up to the king. By the way, technically speaking, a baron just being someone who holds land directly from the king, and so technically, all nobles are barons, or all nobles above the rank of knight are barons in the generic sense. But baron was also a title for a specific rank of noble. So a count, an earl, and a duke are barons in the lowercase b sense, but not barons in the uppercase b sense. Anyway, don't worry about it. The extra class on medieval history. Don't worry about that. Anyway. We see a complicated feudalism, a complicated aristocracy emerging, with layers of defined obligations. Now, mind you, these obligations were defined mainly by the feudal exchange of oaths. So we're still not talking about public institutions and like federal-ish proto-federal layers of government. But we are talking about things that are a little more like that. That are sort of the next best thing that you can build out of a Lego set that only has feudalism pieces. Um, if I give you a Lego set full of feudalism pieces and tell you to build a functioning federal republic, you're going to say, well, I can't do that, but I can get close. Right? And that's kind of what William did. So these were somewhat codified into law, somewhat built into a series of traditional expectations that govern the much more complicated feudal relationships of Norman England, where you have offices that have like a count. The sheriff was you may have heard of like the Sheriff of Nottingham and things like that. A sheriff was an office in Norman England. It was an office at the that a count. It represented a count to make sure that the king's law was being done in the county. So, like, the sheriff represented one layer of the aristocracy, of the feudal aristocracy, the count, and it represented his oversight on behalf of the king. It represented the count's oversight over the lower ranked nobility, like the barons and the earls. Maybe not the earls, but definitely the barons. So what we see then is not quite a functioning bureaucracy, but not quite like we see not quite a functioning bureaucracy, but we see kind of like the closest they could get while still operating within the paradigm of feudalism. Like basically someone like heavily modded feudalism with downloaded mods. I'm kidding. Someone that heavily modded feudalism to make it very similar to a functioning central government with something approaching the rule of law and um, and definitely with central authority that was executed through layers of government as realized in a more complex feudal hierarchy than had previously been established in Europe. So Norman England was the model for a new kind of feudalism. Feudalism that wasn't really all that feudal. We can call it more monarchy. Um, Whereas feudalism is characterized by localism, and while there may be kings, uh, the the weight of the weight of social control, the center of gravity, if you will, in terms of social control, is with the local lords who can make or break a king. Um, but the in Norman England, the right from the get go, right from the jump, as soon as William established this new kingdom, he set it up in a much more centralized fashion, so the authority rested with the king. Now, mind you, again, this is not going to be uncontroversial. This is not going to be a thing where uh, people aren't going to fight it, because there was a general expectation in feudal Europe that the barons were where it was at. The local remember localism and fighting. That the barons were the real power. That kings, kings could establish power, but they could only do so by getting the barons to cooperate with them. They couldn't just impose their authority from the top very easily, maybe by force, and even then that was a delicate operation, usually a fragile arrangement. Uh, I mean, look, Charlemagne conquered all of Europe, and his thing lasted 14 years. So, um, like, it's super rare to see a single family in charge. Like, it's super rare to see a single dynasty hold the throne of, like, say, Wessex in England, in pre-Norman England, for more than 2 or 3 generations. And after that, there's a dispute over who should be king, and a bunch of fighting, and then somebody new takes the throne because the old people are dead. Happened over and over and over. But yeah, William set it up so that it was a much more central, so the power was more centralized, and the barons would not super like this a lot, so there was a lot of dispute over it. And in the earlier years of, in the earlier years of, in the earlier years of the kingdom, throughout a good part of the transitional period in the High Middle Ages, there were disputes and conflicts and internal wars. The Barons' Revolt. There was the succession crisis in the 1100s, and the barons were basically fighting over. The barons were basically trying to decide who got to be the next king, rather than the machinery of succession. Um, yeah, it was ugly, and getting it under, getting everybody to, let's say, realizing, actualizing on the promise of centralized power was more complex than just saying it. But nonetheless, Norman England, which gets going in 1066, sets out with the ambition to centralize power, create a complex aristocracy that functions sort of like a bureaucracy, that can exert authority over the whole of the kingdom, and it creates a model that with some lag time, will be followed in Europe. Um, France is going to lag way behind because what you have there is a bunch of powerful nobles with old lands and powers and prerogatives that date back to the fall of Rome, basically. Um, and the King of France, whenever there was a King of France that anyone cared about, would have trouble centralizing power and exerting it over the nobility. It wouldn't be so close to like the end of the High Middle Ages when France starts to really get centralized in terms of power. Until then, powerful French nobles were almost always were more worth caring about than the king. In fact, for great swaths of the High Middle Ages, the quote unquote King of France held just a pitiful amount of land and authority. He was acknowledged as the King of France sort of due to tradition, but he wasn't even close to the most powerful noble. Whereas for even though he had to fight to establish this a lot of the time, the King of England in Norman England was pretty much always the most powerful noble in England. And he had to, like I said, he had to fight to remind his bearings of that a lot. But he was definitely the central authority. Germany's a mess, and it's going to remain a mess for a long time. In the 13th century, Frederick II kind of pulls it together in a new Holy Roman Empire for a little while, but then he dies in a very stupid fashion, and everything disintegrates into complete chaos for like multiple hundreds of years, with no central authority there at all for a long time. But yeah, so Norman England is a model for a new kind of monarchy, a muscular monarchy, a monarchy with real centralized power that is realized or actualized through a complex feudal hierarchy that functions kind of like a bureaucracy. Okay, so that's a big sign that things are changing. That's part of the transitional period. Another sign that things are changing is the founding of universities. The first university founded in Europe was founded in Bologna, in Italy, in 1088. And the next two were founded in Paris and Oxford in 1150 and 1168, respectively. Now that's during the 12th century Renaissance, not that 11th century transitional period, but still, sign that things were changing. Why is that a sign? Well, they weren't exactly public spaces. They weren't owned by the people. The universities... Paris University was a collection of scholars. It was kind of like a scholars' union, whereas Bologna University was like a bunch of students got together. Let me back up. The short version of how the university in Bologna got going was a bunch of people who wanted to learn, students effectively. I networked with a bunch of scholars, people who had been studying. And remember, this is Italy, so this is an this is an area that has more of the heritage of Rome in it than other places in Europe. There's more urbanization, more of a rule by a civilian segment. I'm not saying it's entirely that way. I'm not saying it's entirely unfeudal, but it's maybe less feudal than other places. A bunch of people who wanted to learn got together with a bunch of scholars, and basically the Saturday morning cartoon version is that the students clubbed together and hired the scholars. In essence, the students created the university. They laid out the rules for it. They laid out the way that it would be governed, which is run by the students. And the university, on behalf of the students, hired the scholars who would teach them. And basically, the scholars helped build the courses of instruction. And so we have a university. We have a recovery of learning. This is remarkable in itself. This is absolutely remarkable in itself because it represents a reignition of the humanistic spirit of the classical era. And in fact, Bologna, one of the main things they were studying there was Roman law. A big part of the motivation to create the university was that they had a large cache of Roman legal documents and Roman books of legal opinion and legal theory, and they wanted to basically create a college of law, in effect. Why would you do that if all the law comes from a guy with a sword? Well, if you're trying to revive the rule of law in Europe, you want to study the last great society that was under the rule of law in Europe, the Romans, and study how they did law. And use that as the basis, maybe, for a new rule of law in Europe. And that's exactly what happened. Cuckoo, right? Absolutely cuckoo. That's exactly what happened. So Bologna represents a mind-boggling transition. It's not exactly a public space because it's run by the students, and so technically it's a private space, but it's more public. It's an institution that stands apart from this class, this warrior class that runs everything. It's a civilian institution. It's an institution that is sort of pseudo-public, much like the church is pseudo-public and stands apart from the warrior class. That's a good sign. And Bologna would inspire similar institutions elsewhere. Like I said, Paris, the University of Paris, second oldest university in Europe in 1150. Paris was kind of like, it was the reverse of Bologna. A bunch of scholars got together and decided that if the best way for them to be able to fund their scholarship was to start a school and charge people for being taught. So whereas Bologna was student-centered and student-run, and the students were the ones that founded it and sort of and they founded the university, which then hired the scholars to teach them on behalf of the students. The University of Paris was a bunch of scholars who wanted to keep doing scholarly stuff, and they founded the university and invited students to come learn with them for money so that they would have money so that they could keep doing scholarly stuff and not have to get real jobs. But nonetheless, Paris becomes again a very pseudo-public institution that represents a revival of humanistic spirit. Even though the main thing taught at Paris initially was theology, it was mainly for training priests and giving them sort of an education that they could then use to better serve that pseudo-public bureaucratic institution that wound up carrying out a lot of public institution functions throughout Europe. So again, we're seeing a revival of humanistic spirit. We're seeing the creation of an important civilian class. Scholars are not warriors. I thought warriors were supposed to be in charge of this society. Scholars aren't warriors. What are they going to do? They're not farmers, and they're not priests. So where do they fit in? The classical three divisions of society, sorry, I shouldn't have said classical, that gives the wrong impression. The three divisions of society that were thought to be like how medieval society functioned: those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. Scholars didn't fit into any of those. They're just civilians who are good for running the bureaucracy and keeping things going. That doesn't sound like a feudal society. That sounds like a civil society like Rome had. Yeah, the fact that we're going to get a bunch of scholars coming out of these universities is going to start changing the fabric of things. And then Oxford in 11 something, 60 something? 1168. Yeah. And then a bunch of other ones start popping up. Not like a bunch, but a pseudo bunch. A relative bunch. Yeah, that's that's a huge sign that things are changing. The fact that that anyone even thought there would be a need for people who did not fit into the three groups of people that make up feudal society. The fact that anyone thought that there would be a need, the fact that there proved to be a need, the fact that soon more universities popped up and there was great demand for university education, this is a sign that things are changing. Or it was an engine of change. Or both. Were the universities a sign that the Dark Ages were coming to an end? Or were they part of what brought the Dark Ages to an end? Maybe it's both. I don't know. I don't know, man. I'm just the one who's teaching the course. I don't know. Of course, the Crusades. I told you about those. The Crusades export a lot of the violence endemic to Europe. Not all of it. Nobles are still going to fight each other in Europe. That happens. But periodic crusading gave nobles a way of going out and fulfilling their supposed function in society without actually having to kill each other. And that's going to be a useful release valve for medieval society. And it will enable high medieval society to be run by a bunch of trained killers whose job is to make war, who nonetheless are making war with each other less and less. How does that work? Well, they make war with somebody outside of Europe. And that's how they maintain their status as professional killers who run everything through violence. But it also brought Europeans into contact with ideas that they had not previously been in contact with. The video talks about how the knights of Europe were like barbarians. They were like unwashed hordes compared to the civilized civil society of Byzantium, of Constantinople, of the Eastern Empire, which was still operating in the paradigm of the Roman Empire. They were not familiar with, again, like I said, in 1096, Constantinople was bigger than all of the cities of Western Europe combined. When the Crusaders got to Constantinople, they saw a different world, man. They saw a society governed on principles that were just dim and ancient memories to them in the West. And that had an impact. They brought back ideas that had become stagnant and half forgotten in the West. And then when they actually got to the Muslim lands, they encountered a Hellenistic society, I mean, not an entirely Hellenistic society. By this time, Islam had taken over, and that's fine. But we're talking about a post-Hellenistic society at least, a society that was running, that was functioning off the what was left from the Hellenism of the pre-Muslim days. The great Muslim philosophers and natural scientists and doctors and poets and theologians were informed by the Greek culture that had been left smeared all over the landscape by Alexander some, 1200 years ago. 1300 years ago, actually. They were still carrying that with them. They had translations of books by Aristotle, translated from the Greek into Arabic. They had translations of books by Aristotle that had been unknown in the West since before the fall of Rome. They have been lost. I mean, scholars in the West knew that Aristotle had written lots of books, but the only one they had a copy of was the Prior Analytics, a book of logic, and they didn't have any access to copies of anything else until they came into contact with Arabic society on the Crusades. And holy poo, there they go. This legendary stuff, literally legendary, was there. It was real. They brought back advanced ideas about poetry, about science, like it said in the video, doctors in 1096 in Muslim lands had to attend medical college and get certified and have a license, and they couldn't sell the drugs that they prescribed. There had to be a separate pharmacist to prevent corruption. And they had a good idea about the circulation of the blood, and they knew what the heart and the brain were for. And I mean, stuff that was science fiction to the West. Right? They were so far ahead, it was crazy. I mean, so far ahead. It's ridiculous. Yeah, the Crusaders came into contact with this stuff. And when they brought it back, they came back with ideas, and sometimes with actual physical books, or works of art that can inspire stuff anyway. They came back with actual stuff, or at least with ideas, and that was an engine of change. That would light fires. We would see how that... either through the Crusades. Well, the Crusades opened up trade to the Middle East through Venice and into the south of France. And so even if we want to say that the Crusaders didn't directly bring back all of this stuff that would have a huge impact on Europe, it was because of crusading that a lot of these ideas made their way into Europe. So, it's definitely the Crusades are a marker of the end of the Dark Ages because they represent the unified power of the Church, which had been building up through the end of the Dark Ages, and is not something that comfortably exists with a thoroughly feudal society. But the Crusades are also an engine of change by bringing Europe into closer contact, violent contact, but still closer contact with the Muslim world, and its advanced cultural and scientific ideas that will transform art and literature and culture and scholarship and everything. So that's huge. We start to see an extensive vernacular literature developed in the 11th and 12th century. That is to say, a lot more literature being written not in Latin but in local languages, like English, famously. When we get the Canterbury Tales. Wait, are the Canterbury Tales in the right? I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I've studied some medieval literature, but I hate it. So, no, the Canterbury Tales are later. But they're an example of vernacular literature, but they are later. But still, we see the beginnings of more vernacular literature in the 11th and 12th century. And that is a sign of change again, a sign that the local cultures are recovering, much like we saw with the Iliad and the end of the Greek Dark Ages. The more extensive vernacular literature in Europe, in French and English and things like that, we're going to see, mostly French at this point, but we're going to see that is a sign of the end of the Dark Ages in Europe. All these things are, some of these things are engines of change that will transform the High Middle Ages. Some of these things that will transform Europe the way that it gets transformed in the High Middle Ages. Some of these things are signs of the changes that are happening. But the High Middle Ages are going to be a lot less medieval, less Dark Agey. And we're going to see that. I may do, so I'm definitely going to do, the High Middle Ages 2 video is definitely mainly about the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. Although it will probably be to some extent about the romantic poetry and chivalry. Yeah, that's what we'll do. I'll do romantic poetry and chivalry. I'll do the Black Death, super fun, and the 100 Years' War, preferably in one video. If I don't get to do it in one video, I'll split those up. And then all we have is the transition to the Renaissance. And it feels criminal, because so much interesting and amazing stuff happens in the High Middle Ages. There's just so much history packed in there. It feels bonkers to do just 3 videos on it. To have just 3 class sessions on it. But that's the way we got to roll, man. Because this is where we are. It's a limited amount of time. We started in Mesopotamia with the Sumerians, and we're coming up to the Renaissance. We did good. We covered a lot. So anyway. Oh God, you hear that? My shoulder popping. Anyway. So yeah, be well, take care, have a good one. I'll see you in the next video. Please drink water. Bye.